We are continuing today in our study of Paul's letter to the Galatians this morning. And as a reminder, Paul is writing this letter to a group of churches in Asia Minor who had allowed a group of, we'll call them religious ultra-legalists to influence them in their faith. Now, we ended 2 Sundays ago, with this idea that salvation came through belief, through the faith that we placed in what we heard. It was all about that belief. In fact, Paul said, if you want to save yourself through the law, the only way that you can do so is to live perfectly according to the law. And so as we pick up our passage this morning in verse 15 of chapter 3, Paul continues his line of reasoning. To give a human example, brothers, even with a man-made covenant, no one annuls it or adds to it once it has been ratified. Now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say, and to offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. This is what I mean. The law, which came 430 years afterward, does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God, so as to make the promise void. For if the inheritance comes by the law, it no longer comes by promise. But God gave it to Abraham by a promise. Why then the law? Now, on the first reading of that, if you are confused by his logic and then the process of his argumentation, you're in good company. It's convoluted the way he's arguing because we just don't think in those terms. But Paul, what he is saying is the covenant, the promise, is all that is needed in terms of inheritance. The law came later, after the promise, and it doesn't make the covenant, by coming later, it doesn't make the covenant more covenanty, if that's a word. It's not. But the law coming later doesn't invalidate the covenant either. So the law neither makes the covenant more the covenant, nor does it invalidate the covenant, because the inheritance isn't based on the law at all. It's all based on the promise, says Paul. Now, I just want to make sure that we understand what we're talking about. So let me put it into terms that maybe we can understand, that are a little more easy for us to grasp. Let's say I offer to give you $1,000, and all you have to do is come up here to get it. Right? Yeah. There's a man with faith right there. What that does is it puts you into a decision loop that begins with one question. Does Matt actually have $1,000 to give me? Because I either have it or I don't. I'll tell you I don't, but let's just stay with the example, all right? Either I have it or I don't. If I have it, based on what I've just said, all you have to do to receive it is believe me when I say that I have it and come and get it, right? All you have to do is believe the statement in order to get the $1,000. And the way that you prove that you believe the statement is that you walked up here. But if you don't believe me, if you say, there is no way he has $1,000, you won't get it. Even if I actually have it, because you'll never come up here to find out if I have it. See, you have to believe in order to get it. So what that demonstrates is that belief is ultimately what matters in all of this. You will only get the $1,000 if you believe that I'm going to give it to you. And of course, there's another kind of transaction, one that we're absolutely very familiar with, and it goes like this. I'll give you $1,000 if you rebuild my fence. We could put any stipulation on that, right? Now we have an exchange of goods or services for money. Most of our economy is built on those kinds of exchanges. So this is a conditional transaction. It's a legal, contractual transaction. I'm offering you the money based on transactional law, which means that you have to do something that we've agreed upon in order to get it. You have to put up a fence in this case. But in the end, if you work to put up the fence, guess what you've trusted in? You've trusted that I actually have $1,000 to give you. Now, can you drag me into court and say we had an agreement, so therefore you have to make him pay me $1,000? Sure you can. But ultimately, the initial emphasis of the whole contract is on the promise that I'm going to give you $1,000. And so what Paul is saying is that the promise and the law, grace and law, to put it in two different terms, are completely different ways of offering something, and yet they both are doing the exact same thing. You can get something by promise, which is a gift, or by law, which is to think somehow I've earned it. But you can't ever get the gift through earning it, right? It ceases to be a gift if you deserve it at that point. That's not, you understand that's how gifts work, right? Or don't work if you have to earn them. And so in this case, the promise of a gift came 430 years, Paul says, before the legal transaction, which means that all the efforts trying to earn the gift all came after the decision was already made to give it. And even if I attempt then to start trying to earn the gift, I'm ultimately doing that based on the stipulation of, is the one who promised it actually able to give it to me? So even if I'm working towards the law and working in the law to try and deserve the gift, I'm still ultimately saying I have faith that God is able to give it to me. And so Paul asks, well then, what's the purpose of the law? Right? If that's all true, if it's all ultimately based on grace, if it's all a gift, then what's the purpose of the law? You see the question in verse 19 there on the screen. Why then does the law exist? And since it exists, is it opposed to grace? He even asks that in verse 21. Is the law then contrary to the promises of God? Now, that question presupposes a logical conclusion. Now, he's going to work through the logical conclusion in Galatians, but he also works through the logical conclusion in the reverse way, on the opposite side of the coin, in Romans chapter 6, chapter 5, and then he comes to the conclusion in chapter 6. Right? He takes the question ultimately to its logical end. We're under a promise, and if that's true, then in Romans he says, should we even obey the law at all? And he says in verse 1 of chapter 6, what shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? And his answer to both that question in Romans chapter 6, verse 1, and also to the one that he asks in Galatians, verse 21 of chapter 3, is no, absolutely not. By no means. May it never be. And he goes on and he says in verse 20, the end of 21 and into 22, certainly not. That answers, is the law contrary to the grace of God? And he says, certainly not. For if a law had been given that could give life, then righteousness would indeed be by the law. But the scripture imprisoned everything under sin so that the promise by faith in Jesus Christ might be given to those who believe. So Paul says, we don't do away with the law, even though we have the promise, because even though the law and the promise appear to be opposites, they're actually working hand in hand together. The law serves the promise, and the promise glorifies the law. This is the apparent contradiction that we have within our faith, within Christianity, and yet it is at the heart of the Christian faith. God has handed down the law, and so he expects us to live in obedience to the law. And yet, we're also supposed to live by grace according to the promise and the free gift of salvation that he offers us. And when you put those two together side by side, it really seems like it's contradictory. But this apparent contradiction is the heart of Christianity, because they aren't contradictory. And in fact, they're found in the very nature of who God is. What Paul is arguing for here in Galatians chapter 3 actually proceeds from the nature of God. It's out of God's nature that we can have both law and grace, and they don't contradict each other.